E ano ai kakau apau, aloha no. Ia ho'i, ai ho'i, e nana I ke akua, ho'ano, ia kona inoa. Ai ho'i ike aku la'au na ali'i apau o moana nui akea. Ai ho'i nana I ko mo'i, kalani ali'i, potato, te wherewhero, e tua whetu. E ka po'e ua pau ua hala o ko, a koe nona pua, e ka po'e ola, e kipa mai o ko. Aloha mai, aloha mai, aloha mai kako. So mahalo for coming to this session. Thanks for supporting us. No pressure. E hoa, yeah. I was feeling a little pressure back there after that introduction. I'm really encouraged though because I'm up here with a fantastic panel. So as you heard through my mother, I'm Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka o Iwi, from Na'ohana Okalama of Laie on the north shore of the beautiful island of Oahu and the beautiful islands of Hawaii. Through my dad, I am Cherokee from Bohannan Mountain in northwest Arkansas, and I also have some Choctaw heritage and some other things. So my tane of 30 years is also Ngāti Kawata, Ngāti Kuya, Ngāti Toa Rangatira e Kaitahu, and some of our, let's see, we have 5 mokopuna now, so 4 kids and 4 mo'opuna now, and a couple of them are Samoan too. So I bring that up because we have these long, and as was raised yesterday, we have these long and old and beautiful heritages and whakapapa and whakawhanaungatanga that connects us. And that's represented in this room and in this panel as well. I'm mindful that we have also this history in Moana Nui Akea of free trade agreements and not always to the advantage of our Pacific and other indigenous peoples. And so if I use my mother's people as an example, between 1800 and about 94, when the overthrow happens, there are about 90 free trade agreements concluded with Hawaii, most of those with the United States. And if you look at those free trade agreements over time, they start off as treaties of friendship and reciprocity and very friendly, mutual benefit in things like sandalwood trade, sugar trade, without many tariffs. But over time, they become more demanding and less reciprocal. And in fact, you can just about read the overthrow in the text of those free trade agreements. And so I acknowledge that this isn't always an easy space for indigenous peoples to speak of. And of course, my father's peoples had the experience of having to concede a little more land and a little more in every agreement that they made with the United States as well. So we come to this space in that sense, but I'm also mindful, and I think this is part of the real heart of this panel, that the word that we use in Hawaii for the Pacific, that thing that covers 1/3 of the earth, the biggest thing literally on planet Earth that is at the heart of this agreement, covers 25 million square miles, or the places where our people settled cover 25 million square miles. That thing for us is Moana Nui Akea. It is the ocean of the great expanse. And so this panel has the opportunity to talk about that expanse, what it might be, and particularly for Māori, Pacific, and Indigenous peoples. And I'm really humbled by my panel. So we've got some questions to keep us on track, but I think very good questions. And so the first opportunity that I'd like to give our panelists is the opportunity to introduce themselves, and as they do so, to answer these 3 questions. So the first is how you came to be involved in Indigenous trade, and this is quite an illustrious panel. What does the future of Indigenous trade look like to you? What can the CPTPP do to help realize the future that you see? And so I'm going to just invite our panelists to answer that one by one. And I'm going to have respect for our kaumatua and ask him to go first, if you would, Uncle Dennis.
Thank you.
Mahalo.
Nagaya wogi, nagaya woenga marago, gumadavienga, gumadawarangara, maramrong tianaganaga, Māori kuri pimo. Just saying who I am, I'm Dennis Foley. I've had a long association with trade, and I've asked the spirits to allow me to walk and talk in this land and respect it as Kuri land, and in doing so, as Māori land, Kuri being the word for people. And in doing so, I always respect elders past and present, and we stand on the shoulders of those that went before us. Our association with trade in my mother's clan, which is the Camaragal of the northern suburbs of Sydney, in the 1790s, Sydney town was starving. They couldn't get any food from England, and it looks like they might have packed up their bags and went home. And along came some very entrepreneurial Māori with some Scottish people and from the Bay of Islands, and they gave the food or traded the food to Sydney town, and the British soldiers got fed, and the rest is history. So we don't hold it against Māori, but that's where our association goes way back to the 1790s. But we also have association that goes back over 1,000 years. And if anyone wants to talk to me about that, I'll gladly talk about it. I used to be a banker. I used to work for I was a state manager for a merchant bank, and I specialised in international trade before I got into the devious world of academia. So I went from one dark area to another. But yeah, look, I've had a long association with international trade, and one of the things that scares me is that in our talks from yesterday and this morning is we're talking macro, we're talking big picture stuff, where the majority of Māori and Aboriginal small business is that, it's small business. So start small, and then from little things, big things grow. So I'm always careful of that. I'm always careful about advising people to make sure that they diversify. And the best place to diversify is your biggest market, which is right next door. It's not biggest when compared to China or Europe, but Australia. You've got over 25 million people, getting up to 30 million people there. It's a great market. You've already established there. There's Māori businesses there already, and Pacifica businesses. You've got great colleagues over there already to work with and expand. So yeah, that's sort of that first part of the question answered, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko pukenaki te maunga, ko ruamahanga te awa, ko papawai te marae, hei uri o, no Ngāti Moe, hapu, no Ngāti Kahungunu, me rangatane, ko Rachel Maidment aho. I'm Rachel Maidment, and I'm the Director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs' Auckland office, and I've been in and out of the ministry over more than 20 years now. But I had 6 years out, and during that time I ran my own business, and that's when I started working in the Indigenous trade space. One of my first and my favourite client was the Hokai Coalition of a collective of Māori food and beverage producers. And when we worked with Māori business, helping them get export ready to head overseas and helping them in market, we also worked with a variety of coalitions, including the Mieri Coalition, which was focused on manuka honey. And we did some feasibility work that went into the collective of blueberry Māori producers called Miro. And we also worked with the Mihi collaboration, which was the Movers in Hemp Innovation, which has now transitioned to Movers in Health Innovation. Now in my role as Director of MFAT's Auckland office, I'm talking to business every day. We're the eyes, the ears and the voice of the ministry on the ground in Tāmaki Makaurau, and every delegation that we have come in, and all the ones that we have going out, we try to include some form of hui with Māori contacts in our area. So that's my background, and I've been told that I can look at sort of the future and really take it back to grassroots. So I'm just going to take that opportunity while I've got it. And this is informed by many years working, like Dennis says, a lot of it happens on the ground, travelling around the country, being in the back room with a lot of these producers. And what I could say is that the future is bright but really challenging. So a lot of what we produce is a lot of what the world wants, and how we produce it, we're producing it in a way that really resonates now with a lot of the markets, but it's really challenging out there for a whole variety of reasons. It's probably enough for now, but looking forward to coming back to some of those issues.
Aloha, Naila.
Aloha. Malo lele, ko Huinga ko Nailasikau Halatuituia. Ko tonga, pa ko kimo pea lea ko kore ke whakatapen ke ho e ke Waikato. Ko whiawhia pongpongini ke ukau mai ki he tālanga kone o e pongpongini. Pacific greetings everyone. My name is Nailasikau Halatuituia. I'm here today. I'm currently working as a managing director for Mana Pacific Incorporation based in Hawaii. And I've been in this space for about 30 years. 15 of those was with the Tonga government, and the rest I was working as a consultant around the Pacific. That's me. The second part of what does the future of Indigenous trade look like to you? To me, coming from a Hawaii-based company, we like to draw on the Hawaiian tradition of ahupua'a, which means collective and equitable prosperity. That's the future I'm looking at for. The last part is how does CPTPP realize the future that we're looking for. When Dr. Jason Mika asked me yesterday, I was so excited to speak. And then I found out last night that the Pacific is not even included. So, but I'll draw on my experience, and hopefully it can and help the Talanoa as we move along. Basically, CPTPP, I'm hoping that any agreement is equality, but I'm hoping that it can be translated into equity at the operational level. Malo apito.
Malo apito. I feel like returning to Uncle Dennis because, Uncle, did you want to add anything about the last two questions there, which was what does the future of Indigenous trade look like to you, and what can the CPTPP do to help realize the future that you see?
Okay, and probably to answer where Indigenous trade goes, if I look back at Australia, and I look about Aboriginal development, many years ago, myself and a lady called Deb Barwick, we wrote the first, and she was the main writer, I might add. I came from a matriarchal society. You always make sure that the lady has prime billing, and that's very important for us. Anyway, Deb and I, we wrote the first Aboriginal procurement policy, and we went to the New South Wales Department of Public Works, and that's where it all started. And within a very short period of time, it meant that members, I was also one of the founding members of the New South Wales Indigenous Chamber of Commerce. And in a very short period of time, we managed to get all the government departments very, very slowly, it was hard work, to procure a certain percentage of their works. And to give you an example, we've got one company that was just a very small stationery supplier. They now supply the majority of the health departments and all of the TAFE colleges. So, and some of the universities. So this one small company that was just a mum, dad and their son is now a very large company supplying stationery up against all the big boys like Officeworks and all those sort of things, and they're doing it and doing it very profitably. So we've got people at all levels. Now along came the federal government, and God love them, didn't you love the state? And the sovereign power of Australia copied that Aboriginal procurement policy and created the Indigenous procurement policy, which was for all government departments. A little bit different because in there you've just got to say you're Aboriginal, sign a stat dec. In the state Indigenous Chambers of Commerce, we have Kinaway in Victoria, we have one in Queensland, one in the Northern Territory, one in South Australia, and one in Western Australia. So they're grassroots organisations. Now, that has allowed Indigenous commerce to grow and grow very quickly. I don't like looking at the upper level, but we now have in excess of 20 millionaires, where before you only had probably one. 20 years ago. I started this work 30 odd years ago. And so in that short period of 30 years, in 3 decades, we've gone from having an almost non-existent middle class to a very strong middle class. We still have half of our population living below the poverty line, but for every Aboriginal business, they tend to employ between 10 and 100 times more Aboriginal people compared to Pakeha, non-Indigenous businesses. So that's where the foundation is. Now, export industries didn't exist 30 years ago. We have nothing on record of an Aboriginal exporter. Now we have many. So when it starts at the grassroots level, and it's controlled by the grassroots level, not the state, not the, you have a word in New Zealand, sorry, because you're a part of it, not the, the government. When it's controlled by the grassroots, it's far more profitable and it's far more effective. And that's where the future is fantastic. In Australia, we had a brilliant organisation called, I've got to look at my notes, the Māori Business Network. They were based in Sydney. I was involved with them in the early days. COVID apparently has knocked them out. They're no longer active. But in Victoria, we have the Pacifica Business Network, and they have a portal. You can go on the web, look at their businesses. That's where, if you were looking at going into Australia, go for the New South Wales Indigenous Chamber of Commerce. Luke McGilroy-Ranga, he's Māori. He's one of the key players in the New South Wales Chamber. Go through him, go through the Pacifica organisation in Victoria, and Kinaway is very supportive. And look at that market. So before you make the leap into the European markets or the American market or Chinese market, look, you've got colleagues over there, joint ventures and partnerships, and there's lots of Aboriginal firms that want to deal with you. You are our brothers and sisters after all. So I think that's where the future lies, and I am coming from a micro level, not the macro. So I do think a little bit different. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
No, that's a great question, and I actually think a great segue into the next question. So I feel like we have gotten a better sense of you all a little bit, and I know that's going to come out more as we talanoa. But I feel like we now have the chance to get into these ideas a little bit more. And so the question that I have for each of you, which is a nice segue from the last question, the last answer from Uncle Dennis, is what does the success of Indigenous business and trade mean to you? So you can add detail to what you previously said, or you can carry on with that. Uncle, did you want to carry on since you're on the roll?
25 years ago, I remember questioning a startup Aboriginal business, and he was in a very racist town. And this gentleman is very dark, and obviously the darker you are in Aboriginal areas, the racism will affect you differently. And I remember him saying to me, and it has rung in my ears, "This is my time, I cannot afford to fail." And I think that's the positivity that we have within Aboriginal society. And, and we've gone through the COVID, we've gone through changes of government, we've gone through different legislation, and we live in a country, my goodness, we're fighting now to get recognised in the Constitution. We're still not recognised. We still don't really exist in our own country. So, but I think that force, because one of the sayings that I've said from the time I started my research, financial independence is self-determination. And that has been said time and time again here yesterday. Financial independence is self-determination. When you are financially independent, whether it be an individual Māori operator, the iwi, or the trust, you have control of your lives and your destiny. You have control of your land. It doesn't matter what the state comes up with, their powers, they can affect you, but you still have control. And I think that's the key thing. If you have control of your life, your child can go to the school you want. You can live in where you want. You can provide food for your family and medicines for them. And that's where we've seen it in Australia. As small business grows, Aboriginal small business grows, the social determinants of success grow as well. So success really is about your position within society. Yeah.
Mahalo.
Yeah.
I think I'll go, if we can go Naila and then Rachel. Mahalo.
Yeah, sorry, taking it all time.
No, mahalo.
Yeah, I'll just take it on from Uncle Dennis's points. From Mana Pacific, we've come up with an approach on renewable energy developing, community solar. And we do realize that we can't put panels on people's roofs, especially in the Pacific, because infrastructure are different between buildings. What we come up with is just one big solar plant and owned partly in a partnership with the community. And we've signed up with 4 communities in Fiji, and hopefully we can get that up and running. That's the model. Our approach is we bring in the technology, which is a solar and storage, and the finance, and the community provide the land. So that's partnership. We create and then we sell the energy or the power to the utility. And the profit of that goes to the community. Our hope is probably 10 to 15 years, the investors' money will be recovered, and Mana Pacific will move out. And hopefully we have trained the community to operate and run the solar farm for the rest of the term. So that's the kind of approach that we take too, sort of bottom-up approach, giving the people that power, that energy independent, that financial independent. And I think that's, we got to change the narrative. The solution has to come from within. I think that's my...
Yeah, mahalo. You've touched on energy sovereignty, which is something that really fascinates me because we see the need for it all over the Pacific. Mahalo, Naila. Aloha, Rachel.
Kia ora. So I'd like to build on what my panellists have said in terms of enhancing livelihoods in a way that is authentic and consistent with values. And I'm just going to sort of lay out some thoughts about all of the producers that I've worked with and if they could have the perfect enabling environment for them to do that and what that would look like. So the first thing I thought about was capital and just having simple access to capital because so many of these small businesses just struggle to even get off the ground. And then an environment that really turbocharges R&D. I saw Wayne Mulligan here earlier, but so many Māori businesses are amazing in terms of innovation and are outspending on R&D. And if we can turbocharge that, it could have a fantastic impact, including for health, looking at health properties of kawakawa and different novel food ingredients, for example. The next thing I was looking at is access and regulations. It's so difficult sometimes for these SMEs just to be able to get things into markets. And it would be amazing if, for example, they didn't have to change their regulations or their labels or their formulations. I'd have companies that had something that was perfect for a market and they needed one change to their label to be able to get it in, but they couldn't afford $40,000 to relabel. They'd have their IP protected and they'd have their Indigenous names and ingredients protected and they'd have their production processes recognised. When we look at producers now with climate change, for example, you've got wine producers that I've worked with and they've had to change when they pick, how they pick, add sugar at different parts of the process, and if they could get that into a market using their own process and have that recognised rather than adhering to rigid frameworks, that would make a difference. Cheap air freight for samples to get them started. I had some companies who couldn't afford, it would cost several $100s just to get their chilled product samples, and it might only be 5 pots of soup into Hong Kong, but that was a real barrier. And then just companies working together, particularly on joint brands and at scale. That's something we tried to do with the Mere Coalition, and that can be very difficult because a lot of the companies have come up through grassroots. They might be selling their honey product at a market, and they're really wedded to their brand, but their brand might be Kaiora, or we had a Hema water. In China, for example, Hema is, all of the Māori sounds are quite similar to Chinese, and so they're often already trademarked, and Hema is a huge supermarket retailer in China. A robust quality mark, so recognising what's important and what's add value for Māori products, And then just talking about Indigenous to Indigenous cooperation, so looking for joint opportunities. And Dennis was talking about this in the procurement space and working together into third markets. It doesn't necessarily have to be Indigenous to Indigenous, but if we could work together on procurement initiatives, for example, in Australia, or if we could work together to go into the Pacific or with Pacific partners into third markets as well. And then just looking at things like we've got these Māori cooperation chapters in our free trade agreements. How can we look at targeting projects, docking into existing things that are already happening to leverage the power, aligning ourselves across government and really looking at how we can, I'm also a trustee on Poutama Trust, and how can we use grant funding together with government funding, together with private sector funding to really increase impact.
Mahalo for that. I can't believe how quickly this conversation is going. and I just do have a couple of pressing, I think these are still quite important questions. Thank you so much for leading into how we can strengthen the ties between Māori, Pacific, and Indigenous nations on trade. But Naila and Uncle Dennis, did you want to add to that? So from here, how can we strengthen those ties?
For me, I think I mentioned it before. We've got to change the narrative, to change our mindset. That will allow us to progress. I think from a Pacific point of view, we've been told that we are small. We are in a vast ocean, but I think small is beautiful. Trans-Pacific trading has been done in the Pacific for millennia. It's not a new thing. And that comes from cooperation between nations and between Kāinga. So, Trans-Pacific is not a new thing. That's the first thing. The other thing is, I think, again, from the Pacific, we were told that we are too small to attract third-party investors to our own initiatives. And I think with Mana Pacific, with our model, we've managed to attract investors that would invest. Because the projects, for example, the 4 projects in Fiji, you're looking at about $120 million US. So what we're doing is that we're putting small communities in portfolios and put different countries into one package. So that allows us to draw third-party investors and also work with our suppliers to reduce the cost. It's just little things like that we can do and to progress our people. I think that's...
I think it makes sense to, if you use the Australian example, to use those existing networks that I've already mentioned, the Pacifica Association, the Māori and Pacific Association in Victoria, Kinaway Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce in Victoria, New South Wales Indigenous Chamber of Commerce, and the Māori Business Association, using those platforms to help you get in. But I remember back in early 2000, I was living in Aotearoa, I was living in Auckland, and researching, and we had this argument going on about a Māori label of authenticity. And there was a lot of talk, and I've lost what's gone on, that train of thought. But that's something that we've argued about in Aboriginal Australia, and we still haven't got an answer, where there was an Indigenous label of authenticity. And it's been thrown around in Australia for over 30 years. So would you pay a premium price for Māori product? I think you would, particularly if it was in foodstuff or in cosmetics or anything in that area. I think you would, because I know that the Aboriginal label definitely gets good sales overseas in that area. Qantas, if you're on a Qantas plane, particularly in first class, a lot of your foods are actually made by Aboriginal suppliers, and you'll have all sorts of treats there, particularly in the sweets area. Is that the case in Air New Zealand? Are they supplying? I don't know, but that would be a wonderful market for Māori suppliers to be supplying for Air New Zealand. Qantas have taken it up, they do it. So I think that trademark concept, getting that label, you buy, in Australia, you buy a New Zealand label and automatically you know that it's green, it's fresh, or it's supposed to be, and it comes with that argument of green. So the Māori label, I think, it's not rocket science. And that would be something that would be so acceptable in Europe and other countries, I'm sure. Even the milk products, the dairy products in India, if it's Māori, it means that it's come from a green, good supplier. I know that's the fashion there. So, it's not rocket science. Māori label, it means equality. The thing about Māori, the thing that I've always been surprised, sorry to talk too much, the thing that from day one when I started my research in Aotearoa was you have something that we lost. It's called tikanga. Māori tikanga is the greatest gift you have. And a lot of people don't realise that value system. When they took us off our land and they shoved us into missions and they broke our languages and they broke our spirit, we lost that value system. You still have it, and you still have it in abundance. And that means that the Māori product comes with a value system that you can recognise straight away. And that's I think is its greatest asset. Yeah.
Mahalo, Uncle, because I think Uncle Maui was talking about something similar too, that this is one of our greatest kind of relational points, is the values that we all hold together. So again, bearing in mind that we don't have too much more time, but I do think this is an important question. It's the $1 million question. No pressure. But what's been the most important thing that you all have learned about Indigenous business? Perhaps something that, is we need to share with the world, or, and I'll pick on Rachel first. Yeah. Mahalo.
I'm just going to quickly talk about that mark element as well, because when I was working with Mihi, the Movers in Hemp Innovation, and we were looking at the US as a potential market, because that's where a lot of food trends start and then they move around the world. Mm-hmm. And we did discover that it's quite difficult to get traction with Māori, because first of all, I've got to understand Aotearoa New Zealand, and that's a barrier, let alone sort of being able to talk about Māori provenance and what that means. But it's very aligned with what is happening in the US now around mission-based marketing. So mission-based marketers were doing really well, and that was very aligned with value systems, renewable energy production, all of these things that Māori businesses do so well. And I saw some really great examples of collaboration. So big producers that had a lot of clout, because the marketing spend in the US is huge, but they'd partner with Indigenous organisations together for that market, and that could work really well. But in terms of the one big thing, I'm going to cheat a little bit and talk about a couple of things. But one is just the power of the coalition and the collaboration. And I've seen it time and time again, and I'm going to use Kitty Nathan and her awesome Kāhui fashion collective as an example, and also the Hokai Coalition. So when Māori business work together in a coalition better than anybody else in New Zealand, and just the power of the big companies supporting the little ones is so important. So the learnings that can be transferred, and nobody is protecting themselves. It's all about giving to others, and that can make a huge difference. So sharing contacts, sharing advice, sharing support, just makes such a difference, and that is such a superpower. And then the big thing, though, is just so much of it comes down to the brass tacks. It comes down to the rules and the regulations and the complexity around that. So just really coming to grips with the nitty-gritty and what the rules are, and then working towards being actually able to access those markets.
Mahalo. Naila, we might go to you again, Hoa.
Oh, thank you. I think, taking on from Rachel's point, as Indigenous people, we've got our values. When you say Pacific, there's not one people. There are different ethnicities. But the good thing, beautiful thing about the Pacific, our values transcend across those ethnicities in terms of collaboration, cooperation. And sometimes we come to study business and they talk about competition and kind of dilute our value. But if we go back to our own value, we can collaborate and cooperate in certain activities or spaces, And we can be competitive on other spaces, but it doesn't mean we have to be competitive on everything, on every space. For example, I mean, in Tonga you can have 3 or 4 small dairies, as you call it. They can combine and sort of procure as one, so you have that reduce your cost and everything else, and then spread out those goods, and then you can competitive in terms of selling it. So those are little things. My point is, there are values that we have that sometimes we sort of went away. That's what I said at the beginning, the narrative. We've got to change the narrative. They said competitive, but for us it's not competitive, it's collaboration.
Mahalo. Uncle Dennis.
Yeah, I think we saw an example of it in the last session last night, where I wouldn't say we had free warring partners, but we had free people with very strong beliefs, and they came together as one. And we have our word in my language is yenibu, and it means to be as one. And that's when a wife will stand with their husband as a warrior in battle. That's yenibu. It's when a brother will stand with his brother in battle. That's yenibu. It's also when the sea eagle mates. That's yenibu, because the sea eagle never mates with another bird. It stays with that partner. And that concept of yenibu is so important, because not only did we do it in battle, but we did it in life. We did it continuously. And what we saw last night, and I'm hoping that I'm allowed to do a little song, because yesterday we had plenty of songs, and it actually touches on that concept. And I think that's united, you will succeed. Divided, you will not. In Australia, we have been divided too long, and the Aboriginal procurement policy is probably the first thing, apart from the Aboriginal flag, that's brought us together. So the Indigenous procurement policy, because it's run by Supply Nation, which is a federal government-funded agency, it's not an Aboriginal agency, that's where we're divided, but at the state level, we're one, and that's where success comes. And we've seen that, but it's going to take us a long time to catch up with our Māori partners. So yeah.
That's beautiful, and I say yes to the song. So
Okay.
I'm sure we all welcome that.
Do you want an Aboriginal song? Yeah. How often? Usually we come over here and we're too frightened. With your allowance. Now this is a song that's done at our corroboree. It's done twice. It's done at the start. And I'm not going to go through all the the actions, because, hey, I'm getting old, and it's not a pretty sight when I take my clothes off now. But at the start of our corroboree, our Huey usually lasts 5 days on the full moon. At the 2 days before the full moon, and the full moon's very special, because that's when the spirit from Nagari, Nagari the moon, her spirit, she holds the spirit of the child, it comes back to earth, and we have the 2 more days. Now the first day, the first corroboree starting at sunset, it's all about leaving your weapons back in your shelter, coming into the corroboree with no weapons, and you come in unarmed. Now there's between 14 and 18 verses, I'm only going to do 2, and so you come in unarmed, and that's what we saw yesterday afternoon in that last session, I think, if I read it right. Now, the last session, correct me if I'm wrong, the last session in our corroboree is one about sharing food, sharing kai. And it's the motions are the fisherman goes out and looks at the sea, scatters his net, and then collectively, all these people that he's not related to pull the net in, and then they have this motion of sharing. And you could have, if you visited Cairns or somewhere like that, you've probably seen the same dance and the same song, because it's done right from the Cape, right down the eastern seaboard. And because we are Pacific, we consider ourselves as Pacifica, and we're saltwater people. So without any musical accompaniment, so excuse me. Daringa name, doraninga nome, daringa name, daringa name, doraninga no, doraninga no, doraninga no. Daringa name, doraninga nome, daringa name, daringa name, doraninga no. There you go. Thank you.
Mahalo piha, Uncle. Mahalo palena ole. Gosh, that makes me feel really emotional. Really appreciate that. I'm not going to cry. But I know that we're kind of at the close. We did have one question, and I feel that this is also a good way to wrap this session up. So our question is, Speaker, you illustrated the importance of whanaungatanga with your whakapapa, understanding the value of relationship building. How would the Crown address having better built relationships? So I really appreciate this question. It goes back to the place of our Pacific people here in Aotearoa and those complex relationships. So as we have heard, we have that long history of voyaging and learning. And in fact, as an Eastern Polynesian, as a Kanaka Maoli, I know I have Fijian and Tongan and Samoan ancestors and Papua New Guinea ancestors and probably Aboriginal ancestors. And those are very old relationships and things not to forget. I'm mindful of Peli Hauofa, our great Tongan scholar, who spoke of our Sea of Islands and spoke of the Va. And the Va is that space between. It's that space that really isn't space. It is relational space, but it's a space that is always closer than you think. And so we continue to have outcomes that are going to impact us all. Earlier this year, I was doing a presentation, and you can guess this was in February. And I was doing a presentation in an SDGs conference. Don't know what made me say it, but I said, you know, we need to be careful that we don't look to the Pacific and we don't say, oh, those poor people in Tonga, those poor people in Kiribati, or those poor people in Tuvalu who are experiencing those horrible things, because it's coming to a grocery store near us, or it's coming to a place near us. And unfortunately, we had the Valentine's Day weather events, and we've had some more since then. So these things are always closer than we think, and these are the complexities that are going to have to be factored into our trade agreements and into our thinking. I'm also mindful that we have complex relationships for Pacific people here in Aotearoa. So many of us have children who are mana whenua, and they're also Pacific, which means that they have treaty rights. If they're Samoan, they should have a recognition of rights under the Treaty of Friendship, which is still in place, plus a long colonial administrative history that is not fully resolved and addressed. We have countries like Tuvalu and the Cook Islands and Niue and other Tokelau, who have special relationships with the Crown, and therefore the Crown has responsibilities to them as well. Mahalo. So these things are not addressed necessarily in the CPTPP. And in fact, as my tokoa Naila has mentioned, it is very ironic that the CPTPP seems to fly over this biggest thing on Earth, and none of our Pacific peoples are partners to this treaty. It's glaring, and then we have the diasporic communities here who are doing their best. People like our Pacific Business Network or Trust, who are doing their best to ensure that we are able to get into the export market. And then we have rugby bodies being traded. We have RSE. And we have all of these things going back and forth over the Pacific, but Pacific people are not part of the CPTPP. So mahalo nui for that question. I'm really grateful. And I don't want us to end on that note. I'm so grateful to our panel. I do want to put that out into our thinking. But I'm so grateful to our panel. They've been entirely generous. And in the way of our Indigenous peoples, we've had 2 panelists who have pivoted and been quite agile to come to our rescue. So grateful to all of you. Mahalo nui, mahalo piha, mahalo palena ole. And when I say that, mahalo piha is the wholehearted. Mahalo palena ole is the I don't have words. Mahalo nui. So I'll lastly just leave us with this last idea. So when Naila was talking, if I had to share an idea of success, it would be aina momona. And aina momona is this idea of abundance. It is of a fat, fertile land that allows people to thrive. And we'll know when the CPTPP is right, because it will produce these outcomes just like our ahupua'a models and our ecosystems, right? It'll spit out those outcomes. If we get this right, it'll spit out those outcomes like a very healthy ecosystem feeds people. So I'm going to leave us with that thought, if you'll allow me, and mahalo nui. Thank you.